The red emergency lights flashed throughout the massive space station that housed the Galactic Council. The warning sounds echoed in every corridor and every room, making everyone know that something terrible was happening. The station had not seen emergency lights like this for over 800 years. Ambassador Kim Tae-ho walked quickly through the long hallways toward the main council chamber. His black diplomatic uniform felt heavy on his shoulders and his heart was beating fast. He had been called from his sleep just 2 hours ago by an urgent message that said all council members must come immediately for an emergency session. Tae-ho was young for a galactic diplomat. He was only 35 years old, which was like being a baby. Compared to most other species in the council, the tall blue-skinned Altarians lived for over 500 years. The rock-like granite people could live for 1,000 years. The gas creatures called nebula mines had no age limit at Alos. He walked. Tae-ho saw other alien diplomats rushing toward the same destination. They all looked scared and worried. Their different faces showed the same emotion. Fear. Some had tentacles that were shaking. Others had multiple eyes that were darting around, looking for danger. The peaceful station suddenly felt like a place of panic. When Tae-ho reached the council chamber, he stopped and stared. The huge circular room was already full of representatives from over 200 different alien species. The chamber was built like a giant bowl with seats arranged in circles going down toward the center stage. At the very bottom stood the Supreme Chancellor, a massive slug-like creature named Multh, who was over 300 years old. The noise in the chamber was incredible. Hundreds of different voices speaking in dozens of languages created a sound like rushing water mixed with thunder. Some aliens were clicking their claws on metal surfaces. Others were making deep humming sounds that vibrated through the floor. A few species communicated by changing the colors of their skin, which created flashing light patterns throughout the room. Tae-ho found his assigned seat in the section marked for newer council members. Humanity had only joined the Galactic Council 50 years ago, which made them one of the youngest species in the organization. Most other species had been part of the council for hundreds or even thousands of years. The human section was small compared to the areas given to older species. Tae-ho sat alone because Earth only sent one representative to regular council meetings. This made him feel very isolated, surrounded by groups of aliens who had known each other for centuries. Supreme Chancellor Multh raised one of his massive tentacles and the chamber slowly became quiet. The Chancellor was so large that he needed a special platform to address the council. His voice was deep and wet, sounding like stones rolling around in a bucket of water. The emergency. The session has been called because of information received from our deep space monitoring stations, Chancellor Multh announced. His voice carried easily through the chamber thanks to translation devices that converted his words into every language. Represented in the council, long-range sensors have detected movement in the dark regions beyond the outer rim of our galaxy. The movement patterns match records from our most ancient archives, the records that we hoped we would never need to access. Again, a cold feeling spread through Tae-ho's stomach. He had studied galactic history during his diplomatic training. The dark regions beyond the outer rim were empty spaces where no stars shone and no planets existed. Those areas had been empty for over 1,000 years, ever since something terrible had swept through and destroyed everything. The movement patterns indicate that the Void Hunters have awakened from their long sleep. Chancellor Multh continued. His words hit the chamber like physical blows. Several alien delegates made sounds of terror, and despite Tae-ho had read about the Void Hunters in classified historical documents. They were creatures of pure darkness and hunger that moved through space like living shadows. They did not have physical bodies like normal life forms. Instead, they were made of some kind of dark energy that could drain the life force from entire planets. 1,000 years ago, the Void Hunters had swept through a quarter of the galaxy, destroying everything. In their path, they consumed the energy from stars, making them go dark. They drained the life from billions of creatures, leaving behind empty, dead worlds floating in space like tombstones. The only reason any species survived was because the Void Hunters eventually went into a deep sleep after consuming so much energy. The surviving species rebuilt their civilizations in the remaining parts of the galaxy and tried to forget about the terrible time of darkness, but now they were back. The chamber erupted in chaos as the reality of the situation hit everyone. Alien leaders began shouting in their various languages, demanding to know how much time they had before the Void Hunters reached populated systems. Others were already making plans to evacuate their home worlds. Representative Kala from the Crystalline Empire stood up on her 6 crystal legs. Her body was transparent and light moved through her like she was made of living glass. "We must begin construction of planetary defense shields immediately," she announced in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. "We will protect our worlds by surrounding them with energy barriers that the Void Hunters cannot penetrate." War Chief Ronak of the Iron Claws disagreed by slamming his metal fist on his desk, creating a loud clanging sound. "Defense shields will not work," he growled through his mechanical voice box. "The Void Hunters consumed civilizations that had better technology than us. We must hide our populations in deep underground bunkers until the creatures return to their sleep." Debate continued for hours, with different species proposing different survival strategies. The gas giants wanted to hide their floating cities in the deepest parts of their atmosphere, the star. Dancers planned to take their people to the empty space between galaxies. The tree people discussed going into hibernation for the next 1,000 years. Taeho listened to all the different plans and noticed something that bothered him. Every single strategy was about hiding or running away. Nobody was talking about fighting back. Everyone seemed to accept that the Void Hunters were impossible to defeat. When Supreme Chancellor Molth called for responses from each species, most gave similar answers. They would protect their own people through various hiding methods and wait for the danger to pass. The pattern was always the same: retreat, defend, hide, and hope. Finally, Chancellor Molth's tentacles pointed toward the human section. The chamber became quiet as hundreds of alien eyes focused on Taeho. Everyone expected him to announce some variation of the same defensive strategy that all the other species had. Chosan Taeho stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the chamber. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Anard, members of the Galactic Council, he began using the traditional formal address. Humanity has listened carefully to all the survival strategies that have been presented today. We understand the terrible danger that the Void Hunters represent, and we respect the wisdom of species who survived their last attack. He paused and looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many different alien representatives as possible. However, humanity chooses a different path, he continued. We will not hide underground like frightened animals. We will not run away to empty space. We will not build walls and hope they hold. The chamber was completely silent. Now every alien was staring at him with confusion and growing alarm. It is time for battle, Taeho announced clearly. That silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the chamber exploded with the loudest noise it had ever contained. The explosion of sound in the council chamber was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. Hundreds of alien voices screamed, shouted, and roared in dozens of different languages. The noise was so loud that the translation devices could not keep up and began making strange crackling sounds. Representative Kala from the Crystalline Empire was the first to find words that could be understood. The human has lost his mind from fear, she announced in her wind chime voice. Her transparent body was flashing with angry red lights that shot through her crystal skin like lightning. He does not understand what he is saying. War Chief Ronak of the Iron Claws stood up so fast that his metal chair fell over with a crash. The sound of his mechanical body moving was like a factory machine starting up. You foolish creature, he growled at Taeho. Do you think your soft pink species can fight beings that destroy civilizations 1,000 times stronger than yours? Other aliens joined the attack on Taeho's suggestion. A representative from the Tentacle Collective waved his 12 arms in the air while shouting, "Humans have only been in space for 100 of your short years. We have been traveling between stars for 10,000 years, and we know that the Void Hunters cannot be defeated." The Hive Queen of the insect swarms clicked her mandibles together, creating a sound like breaking bones. "My species controls 1 billion warrior drones," she declared. "Each drone is bred for battle, and even we would not dare to fight the Void Hunters directly. Your species has no natural weapons, no armor, and no special abilities that could help in such a battle." Taeho remained standing while the verbal assault continued around him. He had expected this reaction, but hearing it was still difficult. Every species in the chamber seemed to think that humans were either crazy or stupid. His hands were shaking slightly, but he kept his face calm and waited for the noise to die down. Chancellor Molth finally restored order by using his emergency powers. The massive slug creature activated a sound-dampening field that made it impossible for anyone except him to speak loudly. "Enough," he announced in his deep, wet voice. The representative has made his species' position clear. Now we must decide how to proceed with practical planning." The practical planning turned out to be exactly what Taeho had expected. Every species began making detailed arrangements for their chosen hiding strategies. The Crystalline Empire started calculating how many energy cores they would need for their planetary shields. The gas giants discussed which of their floating cities could dive deepest into their atmosphere. The Iron Claws began planning underground bunker networks that could house their entire population for 1,000 years. The tree people talked about special hibernation chambers that would slow down their life processes until the danger passed. Hours went by as each species refined their defensive plans. Taeho listened carefully to every presentation and took detailed notes on his electronic tablet. He was learning valuable information about galactic technology and defensive capabilities that might be useful. Later, when the session finally ended, most aliens avoided looking at Taeho as they left the chamber. They seemed embarrassed for him and his species' foolish decision. A few younger representatives gave him sympathetic looks as if they felt sorry for someone who was clearly going to die. Soon Taeho walked back to the human embassy section of the station, feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. The embassy was small compared to the massive complexes that housed other species. It consisted of only 12 rooms, including his private quarters and a small communications center. As soon as he entered his quarters, Taeho activated the secure communication link to Earth. The transmission would take several minutes to reach home and several more minutes for a response to come back. Time moved slowly when you were trying to save the galaxy. While he waited, Taeho reviewed the recordings he had made of the council session. He played back the descriptions of Void Hunter attacks from 1,000 years ago and cross-referenced them with historical data that Earth had collected. The pattern was always the same. The creatures appeared suddenly drained entire star systems of life energy, then disappeared just as quickly. The communication system chimed, indicating that Earth had received his message and was sending a response. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to General Park Min-soo, the head of Earth military forces. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen many battles. The general listened without interruption as Taeho explained everything that had happened in the council session. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "You did exactly what we discussed," she said finally. "The other species' reactions were predictable. They have been conditioned by 1,000 years of fear to think that hiding is the only option, but we know something they do not." No. General Min-soo activated a holographic display that showed star charts and battle analysis data. While the other species were hiding and praying after the last Void Hunter attack, human ancestors were fighting wars and learning how to defeat enemies that seemed impossible to beat. "We have studied every piece of data about the Void Hunters that we could find." The hologram showed ancient battle records and energy consumption patterns. "The Void Hunters are not truly immortal," Min-soo explained. "They are parasites that feed on life energy. When they cannot feed for extended periods, they become weak and vulnerable. That is why they went to sleep after their last attack. They had consumed so much that there was nothing left to sustain them." Taeho leaned forward, studying the data closely. "How long do they need to go without feeding before they become weak enough to fight?" "The analysis suggests approximately 4 months, Min-soo replied, "but that would require cutting off their food supply completely. No species has ever been willing to risk their populations by evacuating entire star systems." "That is where human thinking is different," Taeho said slowly. "We do not see evacuation as abandonment. We see it as tactical repositioning." "Exactly," Min-soo smiled for the first time during their conversation. "While other species think in terms of defending fixed positions, humans learned long ago that mobility and flexibility are often more important than strong walls. We have been preparing for this possibility for 20 years." The hologram changed to show human fleet positions throughout known space. Hidden bases that looked like asteroid mining operations were actually military staging areas. Civilian transport ships had been secretly modified with faster engines, and larger cargo holds. Trading vessels carried concealed weapons and military equipment. "We cannot defeat the Void Hunters in direct combat when they are at full strength," Min-soo continued, "but we can starve them by evacuating populations faster. Then they can consume them. When they are weak enough, we can destroy them completely." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Humans would coordinate the largest evacuation operation in galactic history, moving entire populations away from their home worlds. Just before the Void Hunters arrived, the creatures would find empty planets with no life energy to consume. After several months without food, they would be vulnerable to conventional weapons, but the plan required something that had never existed before: complete cooperation between all galactic species. It would need perfect timing, precise coordination, and absolute trust between races that had spent centuries viewing each other with suspicion. General Min-soo seemed to read his thoughts. "The other species will resist at first," she said, "but fear changes minds quickly when they see the Void Hunters approaching their worlds. They will accept help from anyone willing to provide it." Taeho nodded slowly, understanding the enormous responsibility that rested on his shoulders. He would need to convince hundreds of different alien species to abandon everything they had ever known about survival and trust their lives to a plan created by the youngest species in the galaxy. The next council the session would determine whether the galaxy lived or died. The news of humanity's bold plan spread through the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Within days of the council session, reports were coming from every corner of known space. Young aliens from dozens of different species were contacting Earth Embassy officers asking for more information about the human strategy. Dali, so young, sat in her laboratory on the human Embassy station reading message after message from alien volunteers. Her job as Earth top xenobiologist was to study different alien species, but now she found herself coordinating something much more important. She was building the first truly integrated military alliance in galactic history. The first volunteer to arrive was Commander Yuki from the Star Dancers. The Star Dancers were a species that looked like tall, graceful humanoids with silver skin and large black eyes that could see in complete darkness. Yuki was young for her species, at only 60 years old, but she was already famous as one of the best pilots in the galaxy. Commander Yuki entered So Young laboratory with movements that seemed to flow like water. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never met a flying challenge she could not master. Her people were born in zero-gravity environments and could pilot spacecraft through obstacles that would destroy other species. "I have watched the recordings of your ambassador's speech to the council," Yuki said in her musical voice. "My people have spent 1,000 years dancing between asteroids and hiding in nebula clouds. I am tired of dancing away from danger. It is time to dance toward it." The second volunteer was War Chief Ronak's younger brother, Korin from the Iron Claws. Unlike his older brother who wanted to hide underground, Korin believed that the Iron Claws should use their engineering skills to help fight the Void Hunters. The Iron Claws were master builders who could construct weapons and vehicles that never broke down. Even under the most extreme conditions, Corin arrived at the embassy in a mechanical exoskeleton that made him look like a walking tank. His people had replaced most of their organic body parts with metal and machinery over thousands of years of evolution. His voice came through electronic speakers that made every word sound like it was being hammered on an anvil. "My brother thinks like an old machine that only knows one function," he told. "So young, but I know that the best defense is a weapon that never stops working. We Iron Claws can build tools of war that will function even in the energy storms that surround the Void Hunters." More volunteers arrived every day. The Crystal Singers were a species that could communicate instantly across any distance by vibrating their crystalline bodies. In harmony with each other, they offered to provide communication services for the evacuation fleets. The deep swimmers came from ocean worlds and were experts at moving large populations quickly through dangerous environments. Each new species brought unique abilities that could help with different parts of the evacuation plan. The Flame Dancers could work in the extreme heat near stars. The Ice Walkers were comfortable in the frozen outer regions of star systems. The Plant Shepherds knew how to keep living beings healthy during long space journeys. So Young worked day and night to understand how all these different abilities could be combined into an effective fighting force. She created detailed files on each volunteer species, listing their strengths, weaknesses, and special capabilities. The information would be crucial for planning mixed species crew assignments. Meanwhile, the established alien governments were having very different reactions to the volunteer movement. The older leaders were angry that their young people were joining what they saw as a suicide mission. The Crystalline Empire issued orders forbidding any of their citizens from cooperating with human military plans. The gas giants threatened to exile anyone who joined the volunteer forces, but the young aliens kept coming anyway. They came in small groups using private spacecraft or commercial transport ships. They came secretly without telling their families or governments. They came because they were tired of being afraid and wanted to do something brave for the first time in their lives. The volunteer movement created a crisis for the established galactic order. For thousands of years, the different species had maintained careful boundaries between their territories and their military forces. Now young aliens were crossing those boundaries to work directly with humans. The old system of separate species managing their own affairs was breaking down. Supreme Chancellor Molth called an emergency meeting with the senior alien leaders to discuss the volunteer situation. The meeting was held in a secure location away from the main council chamber. Representatives from 20 major species attended, including some who had never spoken directly to each other before. "The human contamination is spreading faster than we anticipated," announced Representative Kala from the Crystalline Empire. Her crystal body was flashing with colors that indicated extreme agitation. "Our young people are abandoning thousands of years of proven survival wisdom to follow the mad dreams of a species that has barely learned to leave their own." Star System War Chief Ronak agreed with unusual anger in his mechanical voice. "The humans are destroying our social order by filling our youth with false hope of victory against an undefeatable enemy. When the Void Hunters destroy their pathetic fleets, our species will lose an entire generation of future leaders." But not everyone at the meeting felt the same way. A few of the older leaders had begun to question whether the traditional hiding strategies would actually work this time. Deep space monitoring stations were reporting that the Void Hunters were moving differently than they had 1,000 years ago. They seemed more organized and more purposeful in their approach. Held a moss from the tree. People spoke in his slow, thoughtful way. "Perhaps we should consider that the humans might understand something that we have missed. Their species survive by fighting rather than hiding on their homeworld. Maybe that experience gives them insight that our peaceful development lacks." The debate continued for hours, with the older generation split between those who wanted to stop the volunteer movement and those who thought it might represent their only real chance of survival. The meeting ended without any clear decisions being made, but everyone could feel that the galaxy was changing in ways that could not be stopped. At the human embassy, So Young received a priority message from Earth General Minsu appeared on the communication screen with news that changed everything. The latest intelligence reports showed that the Void Hunters would reach the outer colonies in less than 6 months, instead of the full year that had been originally estimated. The timeline for the evacuation plan had just been cut in half. So Young looked at the files of volunteer species spread across her desk and realized that, ready or not, the battle for the galaxy was about to begin. The young aliens who had chosen to stand with humanity would soon discover whether their courage was enough to save everyone they had ever known. The real test of the human strategy was coming, much sooner than anyone had expected. The first evacuation began at dawn on the planet Kepler-7, a peaceful agricultural world that was home to 3 million farmers from the gentle grain grower species. Captain Ohayan Wu stood on the bridge of his transport ship watching the organized chaos below as families loaded their most precious belongings into cargo containers. The grain growers were tall, thin beings with green skin that could absorb sunlight like plants. They had never experienced war or violence in their thousand-year history. Their biggest problem before this day had been deciding which crops to plant each season. Now they were running for their lives from creatures that wanted to drain every drop of energy from their body. Xianwu's ship was one of 50 Vessels in the evacuation fleets, each ship had been modified with larger cargo holds and more powerful engines to carry as many refugees as possible. The fleet also included volunteer crews from a dozen different species working together for the first time in galactic history. Commander Yuki from the Star Dancers served as the fleet navigation officer. Her people ability to see in complete darkness and pilot through dangerous obstacles made her perfect for guiding the ships through asteroid fields and nebula clouds that could hide their escape routes from the approaching Void Hunters. War Chief Corin from the Iron Claws had spent weeks modifying the ship engines and weapon systems. His mechanical expertise ensured that every vessel could operate at maximum efficiency even under combat conditions. The Iron Claw engineering was so good that some ships were actually performing better than their original design specifications. The evacuation proceeded with military precision that impressed even the experienced human officers. Families were processed through loading stations where they received identification tags and were assigned to specific ships based on their biological needs. Some species required special atmosphere mixtures while others needed different gravity levels. Durley So Young had created detailed compatibility charts that prevented dangerous combinations of species from being housed together. The charts took into account everything from dietary requirements to communication methods to ensure that the refugee populations could coexist peacefully during the long journey to Sephidias. The last transport ship lifted off from Kepler-7. The deep space sensors detected the approaching darkness. The Void Hunters were still 3 days away, but their presence could already be felt as a cold shadow that seemed to drain warmth from the surrounding space. The evacuation fleet jumped to hyperspace just as the first tendrils of darkness reached the outer the atmosphere of Kepler-7 behind them. The peaceful farming world would soon become another empty shell floating in the void. But 3 million lives had been saved, and the human strategy had passed its first test. The success at Kepler-7 was repeated at dozens of worlds throughout the outer rim of the galaxy. Human-led evacuation fleets arrived at populated planets with perfect timing, loading entire populations and escaping just hours before the Void Hunters arrived. Captain Nomsu Jin commanded one of the smaller evacuation ships that specialized in rescuing isolated mining stations and research outposts. Her ship was faster and more maneuverable than the large transports, but could only carry a few hundred people at a time. Jin had been a test pilot before the war, and she used those skills to perform daring rescue missions in locations that were too dangerous for the larger ships. She flew through solar storms and navigated around black holes to reach remote facilities that other captains said were impossible to evacuate. One of her most difficult missions was the rescue of a scientific station that was studying the edge of Void Hunter territory. The station housed 50 researchers from the Scholar caste who had been monitoring the creature's sleep patterns for decades. When the Void Hunters began moving, the researchers found themselves directly in the path of the advancing darkness. Jin's ship arrived at the research station with less than 6 hours to spare. The scientists had valuable data about Void Hunter behavior patterns that could help refine the evacuation strategy, but they also had equipment that was too large to fit in the small rescue ship. The station commander, Dr. Kelvak, was an elderly member of the Scholar caste who had spent his entire life studying ancient history. He understood the importance of the evacuation, but he also knew that losing the research data could doom future generations to repeat the same mistakes. Jin made a difficult decision. She ordered her crew to strip out unnecessary equipment from the rescue ship to make room for the most critical research materials. The modification took for precious hours, but it allowed them to save both the scientists and their irreplaceable data. The rescue ship escaped from the research station with only minutes to spare. As they jumped to hyperspace, the crew watched through the rear sensors as the Void Hunters consumed the station and everything around it. The darkness spread like spilled ink across the starfield, leaving nothing but empty space behind. Not every evacuation was successful. Sometimes the timing was wrong and ships arrived too late to save anyone. Sometimes technical problems delayed the loading process and entire populations were lost to the advancing darkness. Each failure weighed heavily on the human commanders, but they knew that stopping meant the end of all life in the galaxy. The evacuation continued for 3 months with mixed results. Approximately 60% of the targeted populations were successfully rescued, but 40% were lost to the Void Hunters. The numbers represented billions of lives saved and billions more that could not be reached in time. As the 4th month began, the Void Hunters' behavior started to change. They had consumed dozens of star systems, but many of the worlds they reached were empty of life. The creatures began moving faster and more erratically, as if they were searching for food that was becoming increasingly difficult to find. The second phase of the human strategy began as the Void Hunters showed signs of weakness. Small attack squadrons led by pilots like Lieutenant Kim Min-ho began launching hit-and-run raids against the creatures. The attacks were not designed to cause major damage, but to force the Void Hunters to waste energy fighting back. Min-ho flew a modified fighter craft that had been equipped with weapons designed specifically to disrupt dark energy patterns. The weapons were based on research from the evacuated science stations and represented the first technology that could actually hurt the Void Hunters. The hit-and-run attacks were extremely dangerous because they required pilots If to fly directly into the dark energy fields that surrounded the creatures, the energy fields could drain power from ship systems and life force from crew members if exposure lasted too long, but the attacks worked. Each battle forced the Void Hunters to expend energy on defense instead of feeding. The accumulated effect of hundreds of small battles began to show after several weeks. The creatures were moving more slowly and their attacks on empty worlds were becoming less intense. The established alien governments finally realized that the human strategy might actually succeed. The Crystalline Empire stopped building defensive shields and started contributing their fastest ships to the evacuation fleets. The gas giants shared their advanced sensor technology to help locate refugee populations more quickly. Even the rock people emerged from their underground bunkers to help build weapons and supply stations. The species that had spent months arguing about the best hiding places were now working together to support the most ambitious military operation in galactic history. Supreme Chancellor Molth issued a formal statement declaring that all species should support the evacuation effort. The old slug creature had become one of humanity's strongest advocates after seeing the results of their unconventional strategy. As the 5th month approached, the Void Hunters were visibly weakened but still dangerous. They had consumed enough energy to remain a serious threat, but they were no longer the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy 1,000 years ago. The time had come for the final phase of the human plan, the direct assault that would determine whether the galaxy lived or died. The combined fleets of all species began gathering at the Kepler system, where humanity had prepared their strongest defenses. The last battle was about to begin. Admiral Kim Dong-min stood in the command center of the flagship Newsor, watching as the largest military fleet in galactic history took position around the Kepler system. The combined armada included ships from over 100 different species, all working together under unified human command. For the first time in known history, the Kepler system had been chosen as the site for the final battle because it contained the perfect combination of strategic advantages. The system had multiple asteroid fields that could provide cover for smaller ships. There were 3 gas giant planets that could hide reserve fleets. The central star was young and energetic, which would interfere with Void Hunter energy absorption. Most importantly, the system was far enough from populated areas that if the battle went wrong, the destruction would not spread to refugee populations. The evacuated civilians were safely housed in temporary colonies near the galactic core, where they waited to learn whether they would have homes to return to. Dong-min had been promoted to admiral specifically for this battle. His experience commanding mixed human and alien crews during the evacuation operations made him the obvious choice to lead the final assault. The promotion came with enormous responsibility because the fate of trillions of lives depended on the decisions he would make in the next few hours. Standing beside him on the command bridge was Supreme Chancellor Molth, who had insisted on being present for the battle despite the obvious dangers. The massive slug creature had become humanity's strongest supporter among the established alien leadership. His presence sent a clear message that the old galactic order was fully committed to the human strategy. The enemy approached through the darkness between stars like a living shadow that consumed light itself. The Void Hunters had gathered into a single massive formation for their final assault. They seemed to understand that this battle would determine their survival just as much as it would determine the survival of every other species in the galaxy. Long range sensors showed that the creatures were indeed weaker than they had been 5 months earlier. Their energy signatures were only at 60% of their historical levels, and their movement patterns showed signs of exhaustion. The starvation strategy had worked, but the Void Hunters were still incredibly dangerous. Opponent's Commander Yuki reported from the navigation station that all fleet elements were in position. The Star Dancers had deployed their ships throughout the asteroid fields where their superior piloting skills would give them maximum advantage. The Iron Claws had positioned their heavily armored vessels at the center of the formation, where they could absorb the most punishment. The Crystal Singers had spread their ships across the entire battle area to provide instant communication between all fleet elements. Their ability to transmit messages faster than light would allow perfect coordination even in the chaos of combat. War Chief Corrin confirmed that all weapon systems were operating at peak efficiency. Battle began when the Void Hunters reached the outer edge of the asteroid field. The creatures immediately launched energy drain attacks that could steal power from ship systems and life force from crew members. The attacks were weaker than they would have been 6 months earlier, but they were still deadly. To anyone caught unprepared, Admiral Dong-min gave the order to commence the first phase of the battle plan. Small fighter squadrons led by pilots like Lieutenant Kim Min-ho launched coordinated strikes against the Void Hunter formation. The attacks were designed to force the creatures to waste energy on defensive measures while avoiding direct confrontation. The fighter attacks worked exactly as planned. The Void Hunters responded to each assault by creating energy barriers and launching counter-attacks that drained their reserves even further. The creatures began to show signs of frustration as they expended energy without being able to feed on the life force of their enemies. Phase 2 began when the medium-sized cruisers moved into attack position. These ships carried the new energy disruption weapons that had been developed from research data rescued during the evacuation operations. The weapons fired concentrated beams of light that could destabilize the dark energy patterns that held the Void Hunters together. Captain Oh Hyun-woo commanded one of the cruiser squadrons and led his ships in a series of hit-and-run attacks that gradually wore down the enemy defenses. His experience evacuating refugee populations had taught in the importance of precise timing and careful resource management. The Void Hunters began to change their tactics as the battle continued. Instead of maintaining their organized formation, they started breaking apart into smaller groups that could move more quickly. The creatures were trying to use their superior mobility to catch isolated ships that had moved too far from the main fleet. This tactical change created opportunities for the third phase of the battle plan. The heavy battleships that had been waiting in reserve moved forward to engage the separated Void Hunter groups. These massive vessels carried enough firepower to destroy even weakened creatures, if they could get close enough for a direct assault. A battleship assault was led by War Chief Korin, whose Iron Claw engineering had created weapons that could function even in the energy storms that surrounded the Void Hunters. His ships charged directly into the dark energy fields, accepting heavy damage in exchange for the chance to deliver devastating close-range attacks. The battle reached its turning point when Commander Yuki led a desperate charge through the center of the Void Hunter formation. Her Star Dancer pilots used their incredible skills to navigate through energy barriers that would have destroyed any other species. The charge created a gap in the enemy line that allowed the main fleet to split. The Void Hunter Forces Admiral Dong Min seized the opportunity and ordered all ships to advance into the gap. The combined fleet poured through the opening created by Yuki's sacrifice and began attacking the separated Void Hunter groups from multiple directions. The creatures found themselves surrounded and unable to coordinate their defense. Final phase of the battle was brutal and chaotic. Ships from dozens of different species fought side by side, using their unique abilities in perfect coordination. Star Dancers guided missile strikes through impossible maneuvers. Iron Claws repaired damaged weapons in the middle of combat. Crystal Singers coordinated fleet movements with instant communication. Lee So Young watched the battle from the medical bay where she was treating wounded crew members from multiple species. Her xenobot expertise allowed her to provide medical care to aliens whose biology would have been incomprehensible to other doctors. The integration of different species had created challenges that no one had anticipated, but also opportunities that no one had imagined. After 18 hours of continuous fighting, the last Void Hunter was destroyed. The creature dissolved into harmless energy that dispersed into space like morning mist. The galaxy was safe, and the impossible had been achieved through courage, cooperation, and the refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. The victory celebration lasted for weeks as news of the successful battle spread throughout the galaxy. Refugee populations began returning to their home worlds while construction crews worked to rebuild the damage caused by the evacuation. The economic disruption was enormous, but everyone agreed that the cost was worth paying for civil. Political changes were even more significant than the physical reconstruction. Supreme Chancellor Molth announced his retirement and called for new elections to choose leadership for the post-war galaxy. Taeho was elected as the new Supreme Chancellor, making him the first human to lead the galactic government. The old system of separate species managing their own affairs was replaced by integrated committees that included representatives from multiple races. The military alliance that had won the war became the foundation for a new form of galactic government based on cooperation rather than isolation. Years later, when new alien species were discovered and invited to join the galactic community, they learned about the day when a human diplomat stood up in the council chamber and announced that it was time for battle. The story became a symbol of what could be achieved when different peoples worked together against common threats. The galaxy was no longer a place where different species hid from each other in fear. It had become a true community where courage and cooperation could overcome any challenge. And at the center of it all stood humanity, the young species that had taught the galaxy how to fight back against the darkness. The Void Hunters were gone, but their legacy lived on in the unity they had unwittingly created. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from hiding behind walls, but from standing together and refusing to surrender to fear.